$25,000. Who can hit the moving target?
They laughed when he asked to borrow a rifle. A sponsored shooter named Tanner Voss looked the old man up and down, the faded ball cap, the windbreaker 2 sizes too big, the hands that shook a little when they weren't holding on to something, and he said it loud enough for the whole firing line to hear. "Pops, this isn't bingo at the VFW. That's an 800-yard plate and it swings. Guys with $30,000 rigs have been missing it for 2 days." The old man didn't answer. He just looked downrange at the little steel disc hanging from its chain, turning slow in the breeze, and he asked the range officer one more time if there was a service rifle he could put his hands on. If you've ever been written off by someone who never bothered to ask your name, type Semper Fi in the comments, because this is a story about what it cost to underestimate a quiet man. His name was Earl Hollis. He was 79 years old, and he had driven 400 miles to this precision rifle expo by himself in a 1998 pickup with a bench seat and an AM radio, because he'd read about the challenge in a magazine somebody left in a barbershop. The expo was a big deal in the long-range world. 3 days, vendors in white tents, banners snapping, the smell of gun oil and cut grass and fairground coffee. And the centerpiece, the thing that put it on the map, $25,000 in cash, in an actual locked case on a table where everyone could see it, to anyone who could ring a 10-inch swinging plate at 800 yards. The rules were short and brutal. Open sights only. No scope. No bipod. 1 cold shot per attempt. No sighters, and the plate had to be moving. They kept it moving with a small motor and a cam, a lazy hypnotic sway, so you couldn't just wait for it to settle. 140-some competitors had signed the sheet over 2 days. 140-some had walked back from that line with their jaw set and their ears red. The pot was still full. That was the whole reason the crowd was thick around the firing point on the 3rd afternoon. People don't gather to watch men succeed, they gather to watch the money survive. Earl had stood at the back of that crowd most of the morning. Nobody noticed him. That was a thing he was good at, not being noticed. He had spent a large and important part of his life being the man nobody saw, and old habits keep their grip long after the reason for them is gone. He watched the young guns come up one at a time with their custom actions and their match barrels and their data books full of dope, and he watched them flinch when the plate swung off their hold at the last quarter second, and he watched the steel stay silent. He wasn't smug about it. There was nothing in his face you could call a smile. He just watched the way a man watches weather he's seen before. Around 2 o'clock he walked up to the table and asked the range officer, a square-shouldered woman named Dana Whitfield, whether the rules required you to bring your own rifle. They didn't. They required a rifle that met the open sight no bipod standard, and the expo kept a rack of loaners for people whose flights had eaten their gear, beat-up trainers mostly. Earl asked if any of them were an M14, or anything built off one. Dana raised an eyebrow and said there was an old M1A on the rack, National Match Sights, iron. Nobody had touched it all weekend because nobody serious wanted to shoot irons at 800 when they could run glass on the practice range next door. Earl said that one would be fine. He said it the way you'd ask for a cup of coffee. That was when Tanner Voss decided to make it a show. He had missed his own attempt an hour earlier, missed it by a foot, and the foot had been eating at him. And here was something he could win even though it wasn't a contest. He started in with the bingo line and the VFW line, and a couple of things about hip replacements that got a nervous laugh from his sponsor's tent. Earl picked up the M1A. He didn't look at Tanner at all. He worked the action twice, slow, listening to it. He thumbed the rounds, 7.62, 168 grain match, what the expo issued for the loaners, and he turned one in his fingers and looked at the meeplet and the seating, like a man reading the date on a coin. He pressed the rear aperture with his thumb and turned the elevation knob and counted the clicks under his breath, building his come up from a number he carried in his head, not in a book. Tanner said something about the dinosaurs. Dana told Tanner to step back behind the line or step off it. The crowd got quiet, the way crowds do when they sense the floor shifting under a thing, and they're not sure yet which way it's going to tilt. And then Earl Hollis did the thing that people who were there still talk about. The thing that happened before the shot. The thing that told the few men on that line who actually knew what they were looking at exactly what was about to occur. He didn't lie down. He walked out to the edge of the firing point into the open, and he looked at the ground between himself and the target. 800 yards of mowed field with a creek bottom cutting across the middle of it. He looked at the grass. There was a strip of taller stuff the mowers had missed along the low ground, and the seed heads on it were moving, and he watched them move. He watched the way the wind walked across that field in pulses, the way it leaned the grass and let it stand and leaned it again. He watched the heat shimmer over the berm and read which way it was boiling. He stood there in the open with the borrowed rifle hanging in one hand, and he did nothing at all for 30 full seconds. And 30 seconds is a very long time when 100 people are watching you, and one of them is laughing. He was not hesitating. Anybody who has ever done this for real will tell you. He was the only person on that line all weekend who was actually reading the problem, instead of trusting a machine to have read it for him. He came down into a sitting position. No bipod, none allowed, but he ran the sling up his support arm into a loop the way they don't teach much anymore, cinched it, and built a position out of bone and leather and 40-year-old muscle memory. His left elbow found the pocket of his knee. The shaking in his hands, the shaking that Tanner Voss had smirked at, was simply gone. It does that in some men, when the thing in front of them is the thing they were built for. He set the front sight on the plate and let it swing, watching the steel travel left, pause, travel right, learning its rhythm the way he'd learned the field. He breathed. His finger came onto the trigger and you could see, even from behind, that he wasn't going to chase the plate. He was going to put the bullet where the plate was going to be and let the world deliver the two of them to the same place at the same time. The wind leaned the grass and let it stand. He waited for it to stand. The rifle went off. For about a second and a half there was nothing. 800 yards is far enough that the bullet has to fly for a noticeable, terrible little while, and in that while nobody breathed. Then the steel rang. It wasn't a clean center clang. It was the off-center gong of a plate getting hit while it's moving, the chain jumping, the disc spinning hard on its hanger, and the sound came rolling back up the field to the firing line a beat after they saw it jump, and the crowd made a noise that started as a gasp and turned into something with no name. One cold shot, open sights, a swinging plate that 140 men with better equipment and younger eyes had not been able to touch. Earl Hollis came off the rifle, cleared it, set it down on the mat with both hands like it was something borrowed that he respected, and stood up with his knees telling him about every one of his 79 years. He did not pump his fist. He did not look at Tanner Voss. He looked downrange at the plate, still swinging, ringing slower now, and something moved across his face that wasn't triumph. It looked a lot more like remembering. The expo people were already half running. Dana Whitfield had her hand pressed to her mouth, and out of the VIP tent at the back, walking fast, came a man in his 60s in a blazer with a lapel pin, the expo's headline guest, a retired Marine Sergeant Major named Ruben Castile, 30 years in, the man whose name was on half the marksmanship doctrine the younger competitors had grown up reciting. He'd been giving a seminar 2 tents over. Somebody had run to get him with the words, "Old guy, irons, 800, first round," and Castile had walked out of his own talk mid-sentence. He came up the firing line and he stopped about 10 feet short of Earl Hollis, and he looked at him for a long moment, and the noise of the crowd fell away because the look on the Sergeant Major's face was not the look of a man impressed by a trick shot. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost he had been taught to revere. "Say your name," Castile said. His voice wasn't loud. It carried anyway. "Hollis," the old man said. "Earl Hollis." Castile said the whole thing slowly like he was checking it against something. "Scout Sniper Platoon, 7th Marines, Caisson 69. Earl didn't answer. He didn't have to. Castile turned around to face the crowd, to face Tanner Voss specifically, who had gone the grey colour of the underside of a fish, and he started to talk, and what he gave them was the part of the story the man himself was never, ever going to tell. He told them that long before there were data books and weather meters and ballistic apps, there were a handful of men in a bad valley who learned to read the wind off the grass and the mirage off the heat, because there was nothing else to read it with, and lives were stacked on whether they got it right. He told them that in the spring of 1969, a scout sniper team had been the only thing standing between a pinned-down rifle company and being overrun in the low ground, and that the shooter on that team had made a call across an impossible distance in shifting wind, with iron sights, on the first and only round he was going to get, and that the company had walked out of that valley because of it. He told them that the technique that shooter used to read terrain wind, watching the grass move in pulses and timing the shot to the lull, had been written down later at the school at Quantico, and that every man on this firing line who had ever been taught to read the grass had been taught a thing this exact human being had bled to learn, and then Castile's voice did a thing it almost never did in front of an audience. It dropped and roughened, and he said that the spotter on that team in the Quezon Valley, the man who called Earl Hollis's wind for him for 9 months, was a 19-year-old corporal named Daniel Reyes, and that Corporal Reyes did not come home, and that the sergeant major knew all of this with such certainty for one simple reason, because Daniel Reyes had been his uncle, and the only reason there had ever been a Castile in the Marine Corps at all was a folded flag and a story his grandmother told about the quiet man who carried her son off that hill and never once let anyone thank him for it. Nobody on that firing line moved. Tanner Voss had taken his cap off without seeming to know he'd done it, and it was only then, with the whole thing hanging in the air, that anyone understood why a 79-year-old man had driven 400 miles alone to shoot at a swinging plate. He hadn't come for $25,000. When Dana Whitfield brought the locked case up to him and opened it and the money sat there in the sun, Earl Hollis looked at it for a moment the way he'd looked at the field, and then he asked her, very politely, if the expo could see to it that the entire amount went to the scholarship fund at the Scout Sniper Association, the one that put the children and grandchildren of killed Marines through school. He said Reyes had a great niece starting college in the fall. He said Daniel always was better with numbers than him anyway, that he'd just done the shooting and Danny had done the math. That was the most words anyone heard him say all day, and he said them quietly, and then he picked the borrowed rifle back up to hand it to the range officer because it wasn't his, and a thing you borrow you return clean. Here is what they tell you to take from this. The world is full of Tanner Vosses, and the world will always be quick to measure a man by his ball cap and his shaking hands and the year of his truck, and the world will almost always be wrong, because the people who carry the heaviest things are the ones least likely to set them down where you can see. Earl Hollis didn't ring that plate to prove anything to the men who laughed. He'd stopped needing to prove things to anyone in a hot valley 57 years before any of them were born. He did it for a 19-year-old who never got old, who called the wind for him on the worst day of his life, and who would have absolutely loved watching a room full of expensive rifles get shown up by a borrowed one and an old set of irons. They keep the plate now out at that expo with a small brass tag on the chain, and every year on the third afternoon somebody points to it and tells the new shooters about the day a man read the grass for 30 seconds and humbled the whole firing line, and the ones who really listen learn the actual lesson, which was never about the shot at all. It was about who you stop and ask, and who you laugh at, and how little you can ever know about the silent man at the back of the crowd just by looking. If you believe the people who served quietly deserve to be seen loudly, if you believe a uniform you can't see is still a uniform, then type Semper Fi in the comments one more time. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today and subscribe to the channel, because we are not going to let these men disappear just because they were never the ones doing the talking.